Hey there, survivors. It's David here. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, let's get started. I bought the radar station because a dead man's daughter wanted to forget it existed. Gerald Koss had operated the decommissioned Cold War-era AN/FPS-35 air defense installation outside Buckport, Maine, for 31 years after the military abandoned it. He used it as a private weather monitoring post, living alone in the concrete bunker, tracking storm systems on equipment that predated the internet, and filling spiral notebooks with barometric pressure readings no one would ever consult. He died on a Tuesday in April, slumped over a console that hadn't transmitted a defense signal since 1983. His daughter, a dental hygienist in San Diego, who hadn't visited in 9 years, listed the property within a week. 14 acres of coastal granite, a reinforced concrete operations bunker with 18-inch walls, a 70-foot radar tower with a rusted dish the size of a small apartment, 3 auxiliary support buildings in various stages of decay. She wanted $112,000. I offered 90. She accepted before I finished the sentence. My sister Renée called me from Portland that evening. "You bought a military bunker on a cliff in Maine," she said, not as a question. "It's a radar station." "It's a concrete box on a rock, Marcus. What are you doing?" "Building something." "Building what?" I didn't answer because the honest answer would have sounded paranoid, and Renée already monitored my mental state with the vigilance of a sibling who'd watched our father spiral into conspiracy thinking before his stroke. The truth was this. I'd spent 11 years as a structural engineer designing hospital retrofits across New England, and in 2021 I'd participated in a resilience study that modeled cascading infrastructure failure. Power grid collapse triggering water treatment shutdown, triggering supply chain disruption, triggering communication blackout. The models showed that every system we depend on is one compounding failure from silence. Most people absorb this information academically. I absorbed it architecturally. I started seeing the world as a structure with invisible cracks, and the radar station was my answer. A building designed by the United States military to survive Soviet bombers, sitting on granite bedrock with 360-degree sightlines and a single access road. My friend Duncan drove up from Bangor to help me move in on May 9th. Duncan was a contractor I'd worked with on 2 apartment renovations. A broad-shouldered, patient man who expressed skepticism by whistling through his teeth and expressed approval by saying nothing at all. He whistled continuously for the first 2 hours. "The foundation has cracks," he said, running his hand along the bunker's main corridor wall. "Hairline, cosmetic. The rebar cage is intact. The auxiliary buildings are disasters. One has a collapsed roof section, the other 2 are salvageable. There are seagulls nesting in Building C. I'll evict them." He stopped whistling and looked at me with the expression of a man recalculating a friend's sanity. "What exactly are you preparing for?" "Nor'easters," I said. He accepted that because it was plausible, and Duncan preferred plausible explanations to uncomfortable ones. He stayed the weekend. We sealed foundation cracks with hydraulic cement, replaced corroded plumbing fittings, and ran new electrical conduit from the generator housing to the main operations room. I'd already ordered a 12,000-watt diesel backup generator, a rainwater collection system, and enough steel sheeting to fabricate window shutters for every exterior opening. By the end of May, working 14-hour days alone after Duncan left, I'd transformed Gerald Koss's decaying weather station into something else entirely. The blast door was reseated and functional. The ventilation system was cleaned and fitted with filtration. The below-grade equipment room was converted into a dry storage vault holding 6 months of freeze-dried food, water purification supplies, medical kits, and ammunition for the 2 rifles I'd purchased legally at a sporting goods store in Bangor. I slept on a military cot in the operations room, listening to the Atlantic wind howl across the granite headland, and I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't experienced in years. Control, preparedness, the quiet certainty of a man standing inside walls he trusts. On June 4th, the first reports surfaced from Lisbon, patients dying in hospitals and not staying dead. I had 3 weeks of lead time. The world had 3 weeks left. The Lisbon footage was filmed on a phone held by a shaking hand. A hospital corridor, fluorescent lights, a gurney against the wall with a black body bag on it. The zipper moved from inside. A nurse in blue scrubs backed into the opposite wall, her mouth open in a silent shape that the phone's microphone translated into a thin, breathless whine. The bag opened. What sat up was not alive in any way that the word had previously meant. The eyes were open but unfocused. The jaw worked laterally with a grinding motion, and the skin had the grey-yellow pallor of tissue that had stopped receiving blood. The nurse ran. The camera dropped. The audio captured 12 seconds of a sound I will carry inside my skull until the day I die. A wet, convulsive snarl layered over the snap of teeth meeting teeth. Half the internet called it a video game promotion. The other half called it the end of the world. The Portuguese Health Ministry released a statement acknowledging anomalous post-mortem neurological events in 3 Lisbon hospitals. The language was clinical. The subtext was terror. I called Renée. She picked up on the 4th ring with the cautious tone she reserved for conversations she expected to regret. "Have you seen the footage?" I asked. "Marcus, it's fake. The Portuguese government doesn't issue statements about fake videos. They issue statements about public panic. There's a difference. I want you to come to the station." "Absolutely not. Renée, I have a job. I have patients." She worked at a veterinary clinic in Portland, managing post-surgical recovery for animals whose owners spent more on pet healthcare than most Americans spent on their own. "I'm not driving 4 hours to sit in your bunker because of a grainy video. From Portugal. Bring the cat." She hung up. I expected that. Renée required physical evidence to change positions. Not argument, not logic, not probability modeling. She needed to see the thing before she'd believe the thing, which was a survival trait in normal times and a dangerous liability in times that rewarded early action. The evidence arrived with disorienting speed. By June 8th, Lisbon closed its airports. Madrid followed. Rome reported its first case. A morgue attendant who reanimated 40 minutes after being pronounced dead and bit 3 colleagues before security restrained him. The European Centre for Disease Prevention used language I'd never encountered in official medical documentation. Reanimated aggression in clinically deceased subjects. The phrase spread across news networks like its own contagion, repeated by anchors who delivered it with the careful neutrality of people describing something they did not yet believe. I stopped monitoring the news cycle on June 9th and began working with focused intensity. The tree barriers came first. 4 large spruce trunks felled across the access road at staggered intervals using a chainsaw I'd purchased in town. The road was the only vehicle approach, climbing 600 feet through dense forest from the coastal highway below. Each felled tree created an obstacle requiring either heavy equipment or significant physical effort to bypass. At the top, where the road met the station's gravel lot, I welded a gate from steel I-beams salvaged from the collapsed auxiliary building, anchored with concrete footings I mixed and poured by hand. I mounted marine binoculars on a swivel bracket at the top of the radar tower, 67 feet above the promontory, providing unobstructed 360-degree observation of the surrounding terrain and coastline. From that height, I could see the church steeple in Buckport 7 miles south. I could see the fishing boats in Penobscot Bay. I could see the highway winding along the coast, empty at that hour, a grey ribbon through green forest. I stood on the tower as the sun set over the interior hills and felt the architecture of my preparation lock into place around me like the closing of a well-engineered door. The bunker was sealed. The perimeter was layered. The provisions were stocked. The sightlines were clear. On June 11th, Boston reported its first domestic case, a dock worker at the Conley terminal, dead 9 hours, who sat up in the medical examiner's office and bit through an attendant's forearm. The timeline was accelerating. I radioed no one. I waited. Duncan arrived on June 10th with his girlfriend, Yara, in the passenger seat and a truck bed full of tools and canned goods. Yara was a Cape Verdean nurse practitioner from Eastern Maine Medical Center. Compact, precise, with dark eyes that evaluated everything they settled on. She'd met Duncan 6 months earlier at a hardware store in Bangor, a detail Duncan offered with a shy pride that suggested he still couldn't believe his luck. She wanted to see the station, Duncan said as they climbed out. I wanted to see if his friend was as crazy as he described, Yara corrected. She extended her hand. Her grip was firm and clinical. Show me your medical supplies. I walked her through the storage vault. She moved along the shelves with the systematic focus of a professional conducting an audit, touching containers, reading labels, checking expiration dates. When she finished, she turned to me with an expression that recalibrated my understanding of how I was perceived. "You're not crazy," she said. "You're undersupplied on antibiotics and you have no surgical capability, but you're not crazy." "Thank you." I brought suture kits, hemostatic gauze, a bag valve mask, and 3 courses of ciprofloxacin from the hospital. They won't miss them. The place is already hemorrhaging staff. Staff are leaving. Staff are not coming in. Half the ER nurses called out yesterday. The ones who showed up spent their shifts watching the news on their phones. A resident told me she's driving to her parents' house in Vermont tonight. Yara placed her medical bag on the shelf beside my supplies. The hospital system is failing before the crisis arrives. That's what people don't understand. The infrastructure doesn't collapse when the infected reach us. It collapses when the people who run it decide to protect themselves instead. Her analysis was the most lucid assessment of systemic failure I'd heard from anyone, and it confirmed what my engineering models had predicted. Systems don't fail at the point of maximum stress. They fail at the point where human operators abandon their posts. The dominoes fall from the inside. Duncan and I spent 2 days reinforcing the perimeter while Yara organized the infirmary she'd unilaterally established in the bunker's secondary room. She created a trauma station, an infection management station, and, quietly, when she thought no one was watching, a separate kit that she placed in a locked cabinet. I saw the contents before she closed the drawer. A syringe, a vial of morphine, and a sealed scalpel. A mercy kit, for endings that couldn't be prevented, only eased. I didn't mention it. She didn't offer to explain. Some preparations are too honest for conversation. On the evening of June 12th, the 3 of us sat in the operations room eating canned chili heated on a camp stove. And Duncan asked the question he'd been holding since arrival. "How bad do you think this gets?" I'd modelled it. Not formally. I didn't have epidemiological training, but I understood exponential growth, and I understood the specific mathematics of an infection vector, where every casualty becomes a new threat. Traditional diseases burn through populations and leave survivors who develop immunity. This didn't work that way. There was no recovery. There was no immunity. There was death, and then there was reanimation, and the reanimated didn't stop. "If the transmission rate is what the European data suggests," I said, "and the military can't establish a containment line within the first 72 hours of domestic spread, the eastern seaboard goes dark within a month." Duncan set down his spoon. A month. Maybe 6 weeks. The density of the coastal corridor is the problem. Boston to Washington is 45 million people in a continuous urban band. If the infected penetrate that corridor without containment, the cascade is mathematical. And Maine? Lower density buys time, weeks, not months. Eventually the numbers reach everywhere. Yara ate steadily through this exchange, absorbing information without visible distress. When I finished, she said, "Then we stop planning for the crisis and start planning for after." That single sentence reoriented my thinking more than any data point or news report. After. There would be an after. The only question was what we'd have built by the time it arrived. Renée arrived at 2 in the morning on June 14th, her car pulling into the gravel lot with headlights that swept across the gate like searchlights. She pounded on the blast door until Duncan opened it, shirtless and holding a flashlight. Her cat, Brick, a fat orange tabby with the temperament of a retired dictator, was in a carrier under one arm. A duffel bag hung from the other shoulder with a winter coat sleeve dangling from the unzipped corner. I found her in the operations room 10 minutes later, sitting on my cot, hands wrapped around a mug of instant coffee. The tremor in her fingers was subtle, invisible to anyone who hadn't watched those hands build model airplanes and braid friendship bracelets and grip the rails of hospital beds during our parents' final days. "They closed the Casco Bay Bridge," she said. "National Guard, full blockade. They're checking people for bite marks." "When?" "Yesterday afternoon. I tried to go to work this morning and the clinic was locked. Dr. Farnham left a note on the door. Just a note. Closed indefinitely. God bless." 20 years of practice, and she taped a note to the glass. Renée drank coffee and stared at the wall. "I spent 4 hours on back roads getting here. The interstate is a parking lot past Brunswick. People are just leaving their cars. Families walking on the shoulder carrying garbage bags full of clothes. A man outside Bath tried to wave me down, screaming that his wife was sick in the back seat." She paused. "I didn't stop. You made the right call." "Don't tell me what call I made." "I let it sit." Renée processed moral weight on her own schedule, in her own interior architecture, and my attempts to lighten the load always landed as condescension. I showed her the bunk room. 2 cots, sleeping bags, a battery lantern, a chemical toilet behind a curtain, and left her to Brick's indifferent comfort. The next morning we established the routine that would govern our days. Duncan took the dawn watch on the tower, scanning the road and tree line with binoculars, reporting by handheld radio every 30 minutes. Yara managed the infirmary and water system. I conducted perimeter checks and structural maintenance. Renée, after sleeping 14 hours, emerged looking hollowed but functional, and took over food preparation and rationing with the quiet efficiency of someone grateful for tasks that required no moral calculus. The routine held for 5 days, 5 days of wind and grey sky, and the generator's steady hum and radio stations cycling through emergency broadcasts that grew less specific and more desperate with each cycle. The governor issued shelter-in-place orders. FEMA activated emergency messaging with instructions so generic they could have applied to a thunderstorm. Then the broadcasts stopped entirely for 6 hours, and when they returned, the voice was military. Flat, precise reading GPS coordinates for evacuation points that we later learned had already been overrun. Duncan's observation log for those 5 days showed the same entry in the movement column. None. Road clear. On the 6th day he called me to the tower. I climbed the 67 rungs and found him pressed against the binocular mount with his jaw clenched tight enough to define the muscles beneath his beard. South Road, past the second tree barrier, in the shadows. I looked. The magnification resolved individual branches, individual trunks, the grain of bark. Between the second and third felled spruce, figures moved through the undergrowth. Not together. There was no group cohesion, no communication, no shared purpose visible in their movement. They drifted in the same direction with the disconnected convergence of leaves caught in a slow current. I counted 5. Their gait was wrong, not the dramatic lurch of the Lisbon footage, but something more disturbing in its subtlety. A stiff, relentless forward motion that never paused to evaluate terrain. One walked directly into a low branch, absorbed the impact across its face without raising a hand, and continued without alteration. "That's not human behavior," Duncan said quietly. "No. They're heading up the road. They'll hit the barriers. And then? Then we find out if fallen trees stop what bullets stopped in Boston." I called a meeting in the operations room. The four of us sat around Gerald Koss's old console desk, which still bore tape marks from his atmospheric readings, and I spread a hand-drawn map of the property across its surface. 5 confirmed infected on the south approach," I said, moving toward the barriers. "We need escalation protocols." "Define escalation," Yara said. 3 concentric rings. Outer ring. Tree barriers and road obstacles. They channel and slow movement without requiring us to expose ourselves. Middle ring. The cleared zone. I indicated the 50-foot perimeter I'd established between the tree line and the station buildings. Open ground where anything approaching is visible from the tower. Inner ring. The bunker. Blast door, reinforced walls, sealed ventilation. "And the rifles?" Duncan asked. "Last resort. Every gunshot advertises our position to everything within earshot. Infected and human." Duncan considered this. Yara leaned forward to study the map. Renée sat with her arms crossed, eyes tracking the topographical lines I'd drawn, with the focused attention she gave to problems she intended to solve rather than merely understand. "What about living people?" she asked. The room stilled. It was the question none of us had formally addressed, though I'd turned it over in my mind during the solitary weeks before anyone arrived. The station could support 6 people comfortably, 8 with adjusted rationing. We were 4. The math allowed generosity. But generosity in a collapse scenario compounds risk in ways that resist clean calculation. Every additional person increases consumption, introduces unknown health status, shifts group dynamics. "Case by case," I said. "That's not an answer." "We establish a screening protocol," Yara intervened. "Anyone approaching gets evaluated visually from the tower, then questioned from distance. We check for bites, fever, altered behavior. If they're clean, we discuss integration. If they're not, we redirect." "Redirect where?" Renée's voice carried the precise edge it took on when she perceived a moral framework being constructed without adequate ethical load-bearing. "There is no elsewhere. We're the only hardened position for miles. Redirecting someone is sentencing them." "Taking everyone is sentencing us," Yara replied. The disagreement didn't resolve. It settled like sediment. Invisible but present, waiting for disturbance. We adopted Yara's screening protocol as a baseline and moved to practical work. Duncan and I spent the next morning reinforcing the cleared zone. We dragged concrete fragments, twisted rebar, and sheet metal from the collapsed auxiliary building and scattered them across the 50-foot perimeter in a deliberate pattern of obstacles. Not a wall, a noise field. Anything moving through it at night would strike metal, stumble over concrete. We'd hear an approach before we'd see one. Renée, meanwhile, discovered Gerald Koss's shortwave radio in the equipment room, a Kenwood TS530S, vintage but maintained with the obsessive care Gerald had lavished on his instruments while letting his buildings rot. Renée had been a ham radio hobbyist in college, a detail I'd forgotten, part of a phase she'd gone through between pottery and marathon training. She had the radio operational within a day and began scanning frequencies with the systematic patience of someone panning for gold. Most frequencies returned static, vast, empty oceans of white noise that made the silence feel planetary. Commercial stations were gone. Emergency frequencies played looped recordings or carried fragmented military traffic, encrypted beyond our ability to decode. But at 7.185 megahertz, she found a voice. A man. calm, methodical, broadcasting in English with a slight maritime Canadian accent. He identified himself only as Lighthouse. He read a weather report for the Gulf of Maine. He read a series of coordinates. He provided a brief situation summary for the maritime provinces. Then he signed off with 5 words that Renée transcribed in Gerald's last empty notebook and underlined twice. Hold your ground. Help organizing. She showed me the coordinates that evening, cross-referenced against a maritime chart from Gerald's collection. 3 points. Grand Manan Island, Yarmouth, and a third that shifted with each broadcast along the Nova Scotia coast. Someone is running an operation, she said. Or someone is broadcasting hope into a vacuum. Same thing, Marcus, same thing. Lighthouse broadcast every 6 hours with mechanical precision. 0, 600, 1200, 1800, 0, 0, 0, 0. His format never varied. Weather, coordinates, situation reports, sign-off. Renée recorded every transmission, filling Gerald's notebook with a handwriting that grew tighter and more controlled as the data accumulated. She plotted the coordinates on the maritime chart, connecting them with pencil lines that formed a pattern I didn't recognize until she traced it for me with her finger. It's a corridor, she said. A sea route. Grand Manan to Yarmouth to a rotating coastal point. The waypoints follow island chains and sheltered approaches. This is a fisherman's route. Someone who knows these waters. That doesn't confirm there are actual vessels running it. The rotating third point confirms vessels. A fixed position doesn't move. A ship does. Her logic was sound and her conviction was growing, and I recognized in her the same single-minded architectural focus I brought to physical structures. She was building a model of the external world from fragments of radio data, and the model was becoming more detailed than my map of the station grounds. Meanwhile, the South Road deteriorated. Duncan's daily count from the tower climbed. 5 on day 1, 9 on day 2, 14 on day 4, 26 on day 6. The infected accumulated against the first tree barrier with the mindless patience of water against a dam. They didn't coordinate or communicate. They simply pressed forward individually and collectively, and the cumulative force was beginning to bow the first felled spruce trunk. I could hear them at night. Not distinctly. The distance and the wind attenuated the sound into something almost ambient, like a distant engine idling. But if I stood at the seaward edge of the promontory in the small hours when the wind dropped, I could detect it, a low, continuous murmur of bodies in motion, of limbs scraping bark, of jaws working against nothing. On the 7th day, the first barrier shifted. 18 inches. Enough to create a gap through which 3 infected squeezed before the trunk resettled. They stumbled up the road toward the second barrier in their stiff, persistent gait, indifferent to terrain, indifferent to the incline, propelled by whatever residual neurological impulse governed their movement. Duncan put them down from the tower. 3 shots from the point, 308, 3 headshots at 400 yards. The sound cracked off the granite and rolled across the ocean like a fracture propagating through glass. Noise discipline is officially over, he said when I reached him. How many at the first barrier? 30 minimum. Visibility is limited in the tree cover. 30. The number was manageable in the abstract and terrifying in the specific. 30 bodies exerting continuous, untiring pressure against a barrier made of wood. Wood bends, wood breaks. Wood is patient, but not as patient as the dead. That evening, Yara proposed burning the road. We pour diesel on the first barrier, ignite it, destroys the immediate threat and reinforces the roadblock with charred wreckage, and creates a smoke column visible for 20 miles, I countered. Duncan's rifle already broke our sound perimeter. The smoke adds visibility, but the auditory damage is done. Anything within a mile already knows we're here. She was right. The calculus had shifted with those 3 gunshots. Concealment was no longer our primary defensive posture. Active denial was. The question became one of resource management. How much diesel could we afford to burn defensively? I reviewed the numbers. 800 gallons in reserve, Ravi's generator improvements, though Ravi hadn't arrived yet, weren't a factor. At current consumption, the generator burned approximately 6 gallons per day. 800 gallons meant roughly 4 months of power. Burning 20 gallons on the road cost us 3 days of electricity. The trade seemed favourable, but Renée raised a different concern. Lighthouse's last broadcast mentioned survivor groups moving south along the coast, armed, organised, looking for staging areas to reach Grand Manan. She let the implication breathe. A smoke column doesn't just attract infected, it attracts everyone. Everyone. The word carried weight I hadn't fully accounted for. In the calculus of survival, everyone included both the people we might save and the people who might take what we'd built. The decision to burn the road was not a tactical question. It was an announcement. We burned it anyway. We had no choice. Duncan and I carried the diesel down the access road. In the grey pre-dawn, 10 5-gallon jerrycans distributed between 2 trips. Yara had given us balaclavas soaked in eucalyptus oil to manage the smell, which had worsened in the June humidity. The sweet, layered rot of bodies that had been pressing against spruce bark for a week. The masks helped marginally. Nothing eliminated it. The scene at the first barrier was worse than the binoculars had suggested. The infected were packed against the trunk in a compressed mass, bodies overlapping, limbs entangled. Some were still active. Arms reaching with that mechanical, purposeless grasping, heads turning toward us with the slow tracking motion of sensors detecting input. Others had been crushed beneath the accumulating weight and lay motionless, though motionless didn't mean inert. Fingers twitched. Jaws still moved. We poured diesel along a 30-foot line encompassing the barrier, the bodies, and the flanking brush. I placed a road flare at the uphill end. Duncan stood back with the rifle in case any came through the gap before ignition. "Ready?" I asked. "Do it!" I struck the flare and tossed it into the fuel line. The diesel caught with a low, percussive thump. Not an explosion, but an exhalation, as if the road itself were breathing out. Fire spread in a liquid sheet, climbed the tree trunk, and engulfed the compressed mass of infected in a wall of orange that drove heat against our faces from 50 feet. They didn't scream. That was the detail I hadn't prepared for. Fire should produce screaming. It's a fundamental association, encoded in the human brain since our ancestors first burned themselves. The infected burned in silence, still pressing forward, still reaching, their movements slowing as tendons contracted and muscle tissue charred. Some took steps into the flame, propelled by impulses that pain could not override, and collapsed into the blaze. The fire consumed them with the indifference of a natural force meeting organic material. We watched for an hour. The smoke column rose straight and dark into the still air. A pillar visible, as Yara had warned, for miles in every direction. When the fire subsided, the first barrier was reinforced with a wall of charred wreckage, fused metal, and ash. Nothing was coming through it without significant effort. We climbed back to the station. Renée met us at the gate, her face carrying an expression I'd learned to read over 3 decades. The compressed look of someone managing multiple problems simultaneously and ranking them by severity. "While you were down there, Lighthouse broadcast an emergency update," she said. "Yarmouth is gone. Overrun. He's consolidating to Grand Manan only." The loss of a waypoint meant the corridor was shrinking. What had been a network of options was becoming a single point. One island, one destination, one chance. "There's more," Renée continued. "He mentioned a survivor convoy moving south along the coast. 40 people, armed, organised, looking for a staging area to cross to Grand Manan. And Marcus." I picked up fragments on their coordination frequency. They're close, maybe 2 days out. 40 armed survivors seeking a staging area. I looked at our position through their eyes. A fortified coastal promontory with deep water access, a natural cove below the cliffs, and a cleared perimeter. We were a strategically ideal launch point for a maritime crossing. That made us valuable, which in a collapse scenario is a more dangerous condition than being worthless. Do they know we're here? I asked. Your smoke column just told everyone within visual range that someone is operating from this headland. The irony was precise and bitter. The fire that saved us from the infected had announced us to everyone else. Duncan leaned against the gate and wiped soot from his forehead. 40 people changes the math. Depends on the people, I said. No, Marcus. 40 armed people always changes the math. Whether they're friendly or not. He was right. I'd designed the station to resist mindless pressure. I had not designed it to resist organized intent. The walls were strong. The question was whether strength mattered when the threat came with voices, plans, and the capacity to negotiate, or to choose not to. That afternoon, the answer arrived by sea. The trawler appeared around the southern headland at 1400 hours. A 60-foot fishing vessel with a dark blue hull and a deck crowded with people. Through the tower binoculars, I counted 14. Men, women, 2 children. They moved with the organized calm of people accustomed to the boat, not the frantic clustering of refugees. Someone on the bridge was operating a radio. Renée found them on VHF Channel 16, the International Maritime Distress Frequency. The voice that answered was a woman, steady and direct, with the flattened vowels of coastal Maine. This is Captain Margot Devereaux, fishing vessel Resolute, out of Eastport. We're mapping staging points along the coast for Grand Manan crossings. Lighthouse provided your coordinates. We didn't give Lighthouse our coordinates, I said into the microphone. You didn't need to. Your fire this morning was visible from 12 nautical miles. Lighthouse triangulated your position from the smoke column and your sister's transmission signature. A pause. She's been broadcasting on 7.185 for 10 days. That signal has a location. I looked at Renée. She held my gaze without flinching. She'd known. She'd calculated the risk of broadcasting and accepted it because the information she received was worth the exposure. I wanted to be angry. What I felt instead was a grudging recognition that her strategic calculus had been operating on a different axis than mine. Not fortress defense, but network integration. Margot continued. I'm running a 3-vessel convoy. I'm the lead. Behind me are a lobster boat and a converted research vessel. We're collecting survivors and ferrying them to Grand Manan. The island is secured. Canadian military remnant. Civilians. A functioning perimeter. It's the most organized position north of the collapse zone. Why should I believe that? Because I'm floating offshore with 14 people, including 2 children, and I'm requesting permission to use your cove as a consolidation point instead of simply doing it. I could anchor without your consent. I'm choosing to ask. The distinction mattered. It spoke to a code of conduct that collapse hadn't erased. An acknowledgement that territory and consent still carried meaning, even when enforcement mechanisms had vanished. Duncan, Yara, Renée, and I debated for 20 minutes. Duncan argued for engagement. We can't hold this position indefinitely. The numbers on the road will rebuild. Grand Manan is the long play. Yara agreed with conditions. We control the cove access. No one reaches the station without screening. Renée said simply, the intelligence she carries is worth more than the risk she represents. I was the holdout, the fortress architect, being asked to open his gates. But the logic was convergent and my counter-arguments were emotional rather than strategic. The station was designed for isolation. Isolation was a depreciating asset in a world where the threats multiplied and the resources didn't. Tell her she can use the cove, I said. Our terms. No one above the cliff line without escort. Weapons stay below. And she shares everything. Coastal intelligence, infected movement patterns, Grand Manon's actual status. Margot agreed immediately, which meant either she was genuinely cooperative or she'd anticipated harder terms. She brought the trawler into the natural cove below the promontory. A granite-walled inlet I'd surveyed but never developed. Deep enough for her draft and sheltered from Atlantic swell by a curved rock arm. She came ashore in a dinghy with two others. Theo, her first mate, a wiry Maliseet man with calm eyes and a nautical chart tattooed on his forearm, and Sam, a teenage deckhand who carried himself with the premature gravity of a young person forced into adult responsibilities ahead of schedule. Margot was in her 50s, broad-shouldered, with weathered skin and a handshake that communicated decades of physical labor. She assessed the station from the waterline with a single, sweeping look. "Your position is the strongest I've seen since Eastport fell," she said. Eastport fell. 3 days ago, 2,000 infected came across the causeway from the mainland. The whole peninsula went in under 6 hours. People had nowhere to go but the water. Most didn't make it. She delivered this like a tide chart. Factual, historical, already processed and filed. I understood then that Margot Devereaux had passed through her grief and emerged on the other side as pure function. Margot's intelligence briefing took place in the operations room of a reconstituted soup. The first time an outsider had entered the bunker. She spoke with the precision of a person who understood that accurate information was now the most valuable commodity in existence. The eastern seaboard had collapsed in a cascade that followed the population density gradient almost exactly as my models had predicted. Boston burned first. Not from the infected directly, but from the infrastructure failures that followed the breakdown of emergency services. Gas lines ruptured without repair crews. Electrical faults sparked fires without fire departments. The infected walked through the burning streets as indifferent to flame as they were to everything else. A convergence of human and systemic catastrophe that consumed the city from the inside. Portland held longer due to lower density and the natural bottleneck of the peninsular geography, but Margot reported it as a contested zone when she'd last had information. Pockets of survivors holding individual buildings while the infected moved through the streets below in currents that followed the path of least resistance, pooling against walls and locked doors with the same hydraulic accumulation I'd observed at my tree barriers. The military attempted a containment line along the Appalachian Ridge, Margot said, tracing it on a road atlas she'd brought from the trawler. It didn't hold. Same math as everywhere else. Every soldier killed on the line reanimates behind the line. You can't fight a war of attrition against an enemy that recruits your losses. Canada, she explained, was in better condition because of geography, through lower population density, enormous northern buffer, and island positions that could be isolated and defended. Grand Manon, 15 miles off the New Brunswick coast, had been secured by a combined force of Canadian Forces reservists, local fishermen, and organized survivor groups. They'd sunk a barge across the main harbor to control access, established medical screening, and begun agricultural operations on the island's farmland. Population when I left was approximately 800, Margot said. Target is 2,000. Why 2,000? Duncan asked. Theo answered, his first substantive contribution to the conversation. Genetic diversity, skill coverage, agricultural labor requirements. 2,000 is the minimum for a self-sustaining community that doesn't collapse from bottlenecks within 3 generations. Someone on the island did the math. The clinical specificity of the number reoriented my understanding of the Grand Manon operation. This wasn't emergency rescue. This was species-level planning. Whoever was running the island had stopped thinking in terms of crisis response and started thinking in terms of civilization architecture. The mainland wasn't expected to recover. Grand Manon was being built to outlast it. The island needs tradespeople, Theo continued. Medical professionals, engineers, electricians, farmers. Margot's been prioritizing skills in pickups, not excluding anyone, but prioritizing. Yara met my eyes across the console. A nurse practitioner, a structural engineer, a contractor with fabrication skills. We were exactly what they were looking for. After Margot and her crew returned to the trawler, the four of us sat in a silence that was qualitatively different from any we'd shared. Not frightened silence or working silence. Crossroads silence. The silence of people standing at a junction point that would determine the rest of their lives. Duncan spoke first. We should go. Yara nodded. The island has what we need long-term. Medical infrastructure, food production, community. This station is defensible, but it's not a future. Renée watched me with the patient attention of someone who already knew my answer and was waiting for me to arrive at it myself. You've known this was the play since you started listening to Lighthouse, I said to her. I knew it was the strongest option. I wanted you to hear it from someone other than your sister. The logic was sound. Every variable pointed toward evacuation. The station was a bubble. Strong, engineered, and temporary. The island offered the one thing I couldn't build alone, a critical mass of organized human beings with a shared commitment to survival beyond the immediate crisis. But the station was mine. The first thing I'd built entirely to my own specifications, answering only to my own judgment. Leaving it felt like amputating something I'd grown on purpose. Margot says the other 2 boats arrive in 4 days, I said. I'll decide by then. 3 voices told me they'd already decided. The 4th, mine, fell silent. The lobster boat arrived on schedule. A 38-foot vessel named the Patience, captained by Colleen Grady, a retired schoolteacher from Jonesport who'd inherited her dead husband's fishing business and learned to run it with the same methodical discipline she'd applied to teaching 8th grade history. She carried 9 survivors, including an elderly couple from Machias named Harold and Vivian, who held hands at all times as if letting go would break a spell, and a young electrician named Ravi Chandrasekaran who'd walked 40 miles from Ellsworth after his car ran dry on a road clogged with abandoned vehicles. Ravi was 26, quiet, with a focus that expressed itself as action rather than speech. Within hours of coming ashore, he'd inspected our generator system and identified 3 efficiency modifications that would reduce diesel consumption by an estimated 15%. He explained the changes to me with diagrams sketched on the back of Gerald's atmospheric readings, his pencil moving with the confident economy of someone who thinks in circuits. Your fuel injection timing is factory default, he said. It's designed for general use. I can retune it for your specific load profile and altitude. You'll burn cleaner and slower. How long to implement? Half a day with the right tools. He had the tools. He'd carried a canvas roll of precision instruments in his pack for the entire 40-mile walk, choosing them over extra food or clothing. When I asked him why, he said, food runs out, tools don't. The research vessel was due the following morning. By noon it hadn't appeared. By evening Margot was pacing the trawler's deck with binoculars fixed on the southwestern horizon, her composure cracking along seams I hadn't known existed. The Warren Foster, she told me by radio, converted oceanographic research vessel, carries 22, captained by Len Park, former Coast Guard officer. He's run 11 pickups without a single delay. He's never been late. I climbed the tower at sunset and scanned the coast. The ocean was flat and metallic, reflecting a sky that promised rain. No vessel. No running lights. Along the interior horizon, 3 smoke columns rose from separate points. Fires burning without response, the visible signatures of a civilization ceasing to function. Lighthouse deviated from his script that night. After the standard weather and coordinates, he added, Warren Foster, if receiving, report status on any frequency, all stations. Increased maritime activity detected in Penobscot Bay. Origin and intent unknown. Exercise extreme caution. Maritime activity, Renée repeated, pulling off the headphones. That could be other survivors. It could also be the Camden Group. Margot had mentioned them in passing during her briefing. A raider collective operating from the Camden Hills region, former militia members and opportunists who'd organized early and violently. They'd been hitting coastal positions for weeks, approaching by water at night, taking fuel and supplies, occasionally taking people. Margot had lost 2 survivors to them 3 weeks earlier. Boarded at anchor, stripped of fuel reserves, left drifting. Did they hurt anyone? Renée had asked during the briefing. They took a 17-year-old boy, Margot had replied. His mother is on my boat. She doesn't speak anymore. The information had landed in the room like a stone in still water, its ripples reaching into corners I didn't want to examine. The 4th day arrived with rain and no Warren Foster. Margot made her decision. 1 more day, then departure. The weather window for a safe crossing was narrowing. Duncan found me in the workshop that afternoon, surrounded by tools I was organizing with unnecessary precision. The displacement activity of a man avoiding a decision. He closed the door. You already know what you're going to do. I haven't decided. You decided the day Margot arrived. You're just not willing to say it. He leaned against the workbench. I've known you 11 years, Marcus. You don't leave things you build. You held on to the firm until they restructured you out. You held on to your marriage until Claudia physically removed your belongings from the apartment. You hold positions past the point of reason, because letting go registers in your brain as structural failure. The precision of his analysis hit a load-bearing wall I hadn't known was exposed. I'm staying, I said. Duncan nodded. I know, and I'm going. The logistics of separation were mundane, which made the reality of it sharper. Duncan and Yara would board Margot's trawler. Yara's medical training made her strategically essential to Grand Manon's community, and Duncan had decided weeks ago, perhaps before he consciously knew it, that where Yara went, he would follow. Their relationship had compressed and solidified under the pressure of the crisis, transforming from a 6-month courtship into something that functioned as a permanent partnership. I envied the simplicity of their choice. I gave them 2 months of freeze-dried food, half the medical supplies, 1 rifle, and 100 rounds of .308 ammunition. Duncan resisted taking the rifle until I pointed out that he'd be on open water for 8 hours with 23 other people and no other means of defense. You're keeping 1 rifle and a fixed position against an indefinitely growing threat, he said. I have walls. You have waves. He took the rifle. He also took the green composition notebook he'd been using for observation logs, filled now with meticulous records of wind speed and temperature, infected counts, and the movement patterns of a collapse witnessed from 70 feet above sea level. Someone should have the data, he said. Yara spent her last evening in the infirmary with Renée. I didn't intrude on their conversation, but I heard fragments through the corridor. Yara's clinical voice alternating with something warmer, more personal, the voice of a woman talking to a friend rather than a colleague. When they emerged, Yara pressed something into Renée's hand. The mercy kit. Morphine, syringe, scalpel. You understand what it's for, Yara said. I do. Use it only when there's no other option. I understand. I need you to say it. I will use it only when there's no other option. Yara hugged her then. A long, tight embrace that communicated everything their words had carefully controlled. When they separated, Renée's eyes were dry, but her breathing was uneven. She turned away before anyone could acknowledge it. The morning of departure broke clear and cold, with the sharp northwest wind that Lighthouse's weather reports had predicted. Ideal crossing conditions. Margot loaded the trawler and the Patience with efficiency that reflected years of managing vessel operations under time pressure. Survivors filed down the cliff path to the cove, Harold and Vivian still holding hands, Sam, the teenage deckhand carrying bags twice his size, Colleen Grady directing traffic with the authoritative calm of a woman accustomed to managing 30 adolescents in a classroom. At the gate, Ravi approached me with his tool roll over his shoulder and his pack at his feet. "I'm staying," he said. "You don't have to. Your generator system needs ongoing maintenance through winter. The fuel injection modifications require monitoring and adjustment as temperature drops. And if we can source a wind turbine from Buckport, I can build a supplemental power system that extends your operational window indefinitely. You understand what staying means. I walked 40 miles alone. I know what the outside looks like. I'd rather be useful behind walls than frightened on open water." He paused. "I don't do well on boats." It was the first personal detail he'd offered, and it arrived with a self-deprecating honesty that made me trust him more than any display of competence could have. "Welcome to the station," I said. Renée joined me on the promontory as the boats cleared the cove. We stood side by side on the granite, watching the trawler and the lobster boat turn northeast and diminish against the grey horizon. Duncan stood on the trawler's stern. He didn't wave. He just stood, his silhouette growing smaller and less distinct, until the distance absorbed him into the vessel's outline and then into the ocean itself. The wind carried the sound of the engines for several minutes after the boats were no longer visible. Then that too faded, and we were left with the gulls, the waves, the generator's hum, and the vast, indifferent silence of a coastline that no longer belonged to anyone. 3 of us. 1 fortress. The approaching weight of a future I was only beginning to comprehend I'd chosen. Renée touched my arm, briefly, without sentimentality. "Let's go inside," she said. "We have work to do." The first week after the departure was the quietest sustained period of my adult life. Not silent. The wind never stopped on the headland, and the generator maintained its mechanical heartbeat through the bunker walls, and the Atlantic prosecuted its eternal case against the rocks below. But the human frequency had dropped to 3 voices, and the conversations between them carried a density that comes from knowing each word matters, because there are so few speakers left to say them. We restructured the routine around our reduced numbers. I took dawn and dusk tower watches. Ravi managed the generator, the electrical systems, and the workshop. Renée handled food preparation, rationing, radio monitoring, and what she began calling external intelligence, a systematic effort to map the state of the coast through Lighthouse broadcasts, intercepted military transmissions, and occasional fragments of civilian radio traffic that surfaced and vanished like objects in fog. Ravi completed his fuel injection modifications on the 2nd day and immediately began planning further efficiency measures. He identified a consistent wind pattern on the promontory, a northwest flow that accelerated over the granite and maintained viable speed for 16 to 18 hours per day. "If I can get a marine wind turbine, even a small one, 400 watts, I can charge a battery bank that handles overnight load," he told me, sketching the system on the back of a supply list. "That drops your diesel dependency by 40%. In practical terms, it means your fuel supply stretches from 4 months to almost 7. The nearest marine supply is Buckport, 7 miles through infected territory." "I know. That's not a casual supply run." "No, it's a calculated risk against a guaranteed deadline. Without the turbine, we hit fuel exhaustion sometime in late October. With it, we reach March. That's the difference between surviving winter and not." His logic was as clean as his circuitry. I filed the Buckport run as a future necessity and turned my attention to more immediate concerns. The road had been quiet since the burn. Duncan's pre-departure observation had noted that the fire destroyed the primary mass at the first barrier, and the charred wreckage created a more formidable obstacle than the original tree trunk. But infected continued to arrive, ones and twos now, emerging from the forest with the random, purposeless drift that suggested they were not specifically targeting us, but rather following the terrain's gradient uphill. I put down 2 from the tower in the second week, single shots at extreme range that I took only when they cleared the second barrier. Each shot was a calculated expenditure. 1 round, 1 threat eliminated, 1 auditory announcement. The trade was acceptable for now. The ammunition inventory said otherwise for the long term. Renée's radio work produced something unexpected on the 9th day. She called me to the console at midnight, her face tight with controlled urgency. On the recorder, she played a transmission she'd captured on a frequency adjacent to the one she monitored for Lighthouse. A different voice. Male, rough, using alphanumeric call signs instead of names. The transmission was a briefing. Grid coordinates for coastal positions between Penobscot Bay and Passamaquoddy Bay, each accompanied by a terse description of assets and defenses. Fuel stores, food supplies, weapons observed, population estimates, and a rotation schedule for approach vectors. It was a target list, and we were on it. The voice said, Buckport Headland, radar installation 2 to 3 confirmed fixed defensive position, diesel reserves probable, recommend maritime approach from northeast. My hands went cold. Not from fear, but from the specific chill of being observed by someone you didn't know was watching. We'd been surveilled. Someone, presumably from the Camden Raider Group, had scouted us from the water, counted us, assessed our defenses, and reported back to a command structure that was planning systematic raids along the coast. When? I asked Renée. The schedule uses coded day references I can't break. Could be days. Could be weeks. Can you track the frequency? Determine their location? I can try. But if they're mobile, the signal moves. I stood in the dim operations room, surrounded by Gerald Coss's taped-up pressure readings and the ghosts of Cold War vigilance, and I understood that the nature of the threat had fundamentally changed. The dead were a physics problem. The living was something far more dangerous. I presented Ravi with the problem the next morning. How do you deny maritime access to the cove without destroying it? He thought for 3 minutes, a duration I measured because his focused silence had a quality that demanded patience, and then said, You don't deny access. You deny exit. Let them come in. Don't let them come up. Explain. The cliff path is the only route from the cove to the promontory. It's a natural choke point. Narrow, exposed, carved into granite with a 30-degree grade. If we remove a 20-foot section at the midpoint, anyone in the cove is contained. They can anchor, they can land, but they can't reach us. We'd also lose our own access to the water. Correct. That's the trade. Renée's position was immediate. That cuts off our evacuation route. If the station becomes untenable, we need a way to the water. If the station becomes untenable, Ravi replied, a path won't save us. The same raiders who approach by boat will control the water. Our only advantage is altitude and fortification. The path compromises both. The argument circled for an hour before arriving at the decision I'd known was inevitable from the moment Renée played the intercepted transmission. The cove was an asset when Margot used it cooperatively. It was a vulnerability now that the Camden Group had identified it as an approach vector. The path was a bridge, and bridges work in both directions. We destroy the path, I said. Ravi built the charge in the workshop using diesel-soaked ammonium nitrate from Gerald's garden shed, packed into a steel pipe with a detonator he fashioned from electrical wire and a 9-volt battery. His hands were steady the entire time. Mine were not. We placed the charge at the narrowest point of the cliff path, a section where the granite pinched to a 3-foot ledge with a 60-foot drop to the rocks below. Ravi connected the firing wire, ran it up to the promontory, and handed me the battery. "On your call," he said. I looked at the cove one last time. The water was grey-green and calm, sheltered by the granite arm. It was the place where Margot had anchored, where Duncan had boarded the trawler, where the possibility of departure had lived. Closing it meant accepting that we were no longer people who might leave. We were people who had chosen to remain. Fire! The detonation was sharp and contained. A crack that split the morning air and dislodged the clean section of ledge, sending granite cascading into the water below. Where there had been a path, there was now a vertical face of fractured stone. Nothing was climbing it without technical equipment. The sound echoed off the water and faded into the wind. "Done," Ravi said. "Done." The word carried a finality that settled over the station like a change in atmospheric pressure. We were sealed. The fortress was complete. Not in the aspirational sense of a project under construction, but in the terminal sense of a system that had reached its final configuration. No more modifications. No more options. The walls. The cleared zone, the burned road, the broken path. This was the shape of our survival. Renée didn't speak for the rest of the morning. She sat at the radio console with Gerald's headphones, scanning frequencies with the mechanical persistence that had become her method of processing events she couldn't change. At noon, she found something. A fragment of Lighthouse's voice, fading and distorted, delivering what sounded like a final broadcast. The coordinates were gone. The weather report was gone. What remained was a single sentence, repeated 3 times before the signal dissolved into static. "Gran Manon holds. Come if you can." She wrote it in the notebook, closed it and placed it on the console beside the radio. Then she turned to me with an expression I'd never seen on my sister's face. Not fear, not anger, not resignation, but a kind of structural acceptance. The look of a person who has inventoried all possible futures and made peace with the one she's standing in. "We hold," she said. "We hold," I agreed. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of movement from the south road. Distant. Persistent. The dead, continuing their patient, mindless approach toward walls they would never understand and never stop testing. The Camden group came on a Thursday, 3 weeks after we blew the path. Ravi spotted them first. 2 vessels approaching from the northeast at dawn. Running without navigation lights. A lobster boat and a rigid hull inflatable, moving in formation with the coordinated discipline of people who'd done this before. Through the tower binoculars, I counted 11 individuals. They carried firearms visibly, rifles slung across chests, sidearms on hips. Their body language communicated something I recognized from years of working with construction crews, the relaxed confidence of a team executing a familiar operation. They entered the cove at low speed, the lobster boat nosing towards the shore where the cliff path had been. I watched through the binoculars as a man on the bow studied the destroyed ledge, then turned to speak to someone in the wheelhouse. Even without audio, I could read the recalculation in his posture. The shift from expectation to assessment, the pause of a plan encountering its first deviation. The inflatables circled the cove's perimeter, mapping the granite walls. There was no alternative ascent. The promontory's seaward face was a near-vertical cliff, 70 feet of exposed rock that would require climbing gear and time to scale. We had removed the only easy route, and the cove's geography did the rest. They tried anyway. 2 men in the inflatable approached the cliff base with grappling equipment. Ravi and I watched from the promontory's edge, concealed behind the granite lip. The first grapple hit the rock face and held. 1 man began to climb. I fired a single round from the .308 into the water 6 feet from the inflatable's hull. The sound was enormous. amplified by the cove's acoustics into something that rang off the granite like a cathedral bell. The climbing man froze. The man in the inflatable looked up. "Private position," I called down. "Next round isn't a warning." A voice from the lobster boat, amplified by a bullhorn distorted by echo. "We're just looking for supplies, friend, no need for hostility. You're looking at a fortified position with overlapping fields of fire and no accessible approach. Turn around." Silence. The climber descended. The inflatable retreated to the lobster boat. I watched through the binoculars as a conversation took place on the deck. Gestures, pointing, a man studying the cliff face with binoculars of his own. The discussion lasted 12 minutes. Then they left. The two vessels reversed out of the cove and turned southwest, moving along the coast toward whatever target came next on their list. I watched until they disappeared around the headland, and then I watched the empty water for another hour, because trust, once broken at the civilizational level, doesn't reassemble on the evidence of a single retreat. Renée found me still on the tower at midday. She'd brought water and a packet of freeze-dried stew she'd prepared on the camp stove. We ate in silence, sitting on the tower platform with our legs hanging over the edge and the Atlantic sprawled below us in every shade of grey the spectrum allowed. "They'll come back," she said. "Maybe. With more people, better equipment. Maybe." "You're not worried." "I'm always worried. I've been worried since 2021. The difference is that now the worry has a shape and the shape has walls around it." She almost smiled. Not quite. The muscles engaged, but the expression stalled at the threshold of completion, held back by the accumulated weight of everything that had happened since she'd driven through the night from Portland with a cat in a carrier and a coat sleeve hanging from her bag. Gerald Koss spent 31 years in this bunker tracking weather patterns that nobody cared about, she said. He died alone at his console, and then we came and turned his life's work into a fortress. He'd probably appreciate the upgrade. He'd probably wonder what the hell happened to the world. Wouldn't we all? Renée leaned back against the tower railing and closed her eyes. Brick, who had somehow followed her up the ladder, an achievement I still can't explain, settled in her lap and began his mechanical purring. Below us, the station held. The walls, the wire, the silence, and the sea. Above us, the radar dish, rusted, immovable, pointed at a sky that no longer had anything to say, kept its vigil anyway. Winter came with ice that sealed the cove and wind that tested every joint I'd welded. Ravi's generator modifications held. The diesel burned slow and steady through December, through January, through the deepest cold I'd ever experienced on the Maine coast. We ate carefully. We slept in shifts. We watched the road, where the infected came less frequently as temperatures dropped, their bodies stiffening, their movements slowing to a crawl that the cold eventually stopped altogether, leaving frozen figures standing in the trees like monuments to a catastrophe that refused to end cleanly. Renée monitored the radio every night. Grand Manan transmitted a weekly status pulse. Population counts, weather, a simple encoded confirmation of continued existence. 1,200 people by December, 1,400 by February. Growing. I thought about Duncan sometimes, standing on the trawler's stern, growing smaller against the horizon. I thought about Yara's mercy kit in the locked cabinet. I thought about Gerald Koss dying alone at his console, tracking storms that nobody watched. I didn't build this place to survive the end of the world. I built it to prove that structure holds when everything else fails. The walls held. The ice melted. Spring came. We were still here,